Looking at the multi-billion-dollar video game industry today,
It's a major entertainment industry, bigger than the movie business.
I don't think anyone could have imagined that coming from such humble origin.
Okay, 1-0.
Ralph Baer built this little machine in his basement that changed the world.
Ralph claimed that he invented Pong. He didn't.
I said this patent's bull.
It was really a free-for-all.
There was a lot of pot.
This is how we put out games, huh?
There were all these stories about sex in the Atari hot tub.
It was sex, drugs, and video games.
Atari went from being just a hippy-dippy company to we're making money.
Nolan Bushnell, you are an acknowledged visionary.
I was young and dumb. Never run a company before.
Everybody had the same reaction. What the is Nolan talking about? What is he talking about?
There were a lot of powerful characters, butting heads.
Sega was David fighting Goliath. We took Nintendo on. I used to get nasty letters from Howard Lincoln.
It was just a great fight between two companies.
It was always personal.
They were a bully.
There was nothing like the roller coaster ride of early video games.
The video game frontier was wild.
Yeah, it was the Wild West.
When I was in engineering school, I started working at an amusement park in the games department.
How about you, sir? Take a chance, 3 for a dime, win a beautiful prize.
So that sort of qualifies me as a carny.
Well, hurry, hurry, hurry. Who's going to take another chance?
I got a good cross-section of what people liked, what they were willing to pay, and how often they'd play it. What it was really focused on is getting people to play over and over and over again, even though they lose.
Missed again. How about another chance?
And when you're convincing other people that they can win, you convince yourself. So over time, you realize that the future is actually quite manipulable with just force of will.
Through this experience, Nolan Bushnell understood games as sort of an industry. And then he just so happened to be an undergraduate at the very university that was the center, ground zero for development of computer graphics.
I was an engineering student at the University of Utah, and there I played a game called Space War. Space War was a rocket ship against rocket ship two-player game. It had a gravity field around a sun, and you basically could fire a missile at each other. And I was mesmerized by it.
Nolan's goal was to put a coin slot on that and put it in the arcade. The only problem was you need $1 million machine.
Space War was played on a $1 million computer. And the economics of the coin-op business said that maximum you could charge was about 25 cents for 3 minutes.
Look what you get for your money, if you like that sort of thing.
You just can't make the numbers work. And I said, you know, someday.
Across the bay with its spider web of bridges, the pinnacles of San Francisco catching the afternoon sun.
After I got my engineering degree, I got a job at Ampex in the middle of Silicon Valley. At the time, Silicon Valley was more known for prune orchards than for technology.
Miles and miles of fragrant orchards, spreading in a vista of never-ending loveliness.
There was no consumer electronics going on in the valley, to my knowledge, at all. It was really semiconductor companies and aerospace military companies.
Ampex was white shirt, black tie, very stuffy. It was the 70s, and we all had our hippie costumes. So I wasn't particularly excited to work for Ampex, but my office mate, Ted Dabney, was probably one of the best engineers Ampex had. And remember, Space War simmered in the back of my head. Well, I blinked, and one day the cost of MSI chips went from $2.80 a piece to 15 cents. And when I saw that price drop, I said, now's the time to build a Space War clone. And that was Computer Space. The The circuit was coming along nicely, but when it came to a cabinet, I thought, this is a space game. So I modeled this spacey-looking thing, and Ted found a fiberglass boat manufacturer to scale it up.
It was a very futuristic fiberglass cabinet, which was really amazing. Sparkly colors. Looked like a kind of a deco rocket ship.
Next to college campuses, computer space earned extremely well. But put it in a working man's bar, earned nothing.
It had all these buttons and, people couldn't get it. They didn't understand how to play it, And geeks could get it because they used to computers.
It was very disappointing. That was when I learned that the core axiom of good games is easy to learn, difficult to master. Well, not for a femtosecond did I think that I was going to go back to Ampex. So I decided to go off and start a company with Ted, and eventually we called it Atari. My first hire was a big bear of a man named Al Alcorn. He was a brilliant, brilliant man and an anarchist.
I figured it would fail in about a year and I'd go back to work at Ampex. That was my plan. So I show up to work and said, what are you gonna do?
The very first day Al started, I assigned him a simple training mission.
Nolan describes a tennis game with one moving spot, score digits, a net, and 2 paddles. So it was just the simplest possible game you could ever do. I understood what it was to be. Whether it would sell or not, I assume it wouldn't.
I think he had it done in a week. And that turned out, of course, to be Pong.
When my dad, Ralph, first saw Pong, he did recognize that it was a derivative product from what he had come up with before.
I mean, it was always pretty obvious that my father had started this stuff, and this is his idea gone.
One of the most important people in this industry was Ralph Baer, of course.
Whip out your handy-dandy sweet tooth scrubber.
He was always thinking of ways to use whatever was around to do other things.
And that included things like, for example, action games that we all know.
Hopefully we'll have some fun here. And if you all gather around, we will play a game of ping pong together. Here we go. Up and down and up. It's getting tricky.
Did I steal Ralph Baer's idea? Yes and no.
A 1, a 2, a 3.
I thought it was just barely a game.
And what we've built, we call the all-purpose box. The plug-in modules will cover a variety of applications, such as TV gaming.
There's no doubt that Ralph Baer invented the home television game console, no doubt. So I think he's kind of an interesting guy.
He's born in 1922 in Germany during the rise of Hitler. My father made it out of Germany just in the nick of time, 6 months before Kristallnacht. Most of the Baer family perishes in the concentration camps.
But Ralph settled in New York, and he was a radio technician. He just had a knack for the technical. On the 1st of September 1966, my dad was sitting down at the Port Authority building in New York, and he had had ideas of using television for more than just a passive machine for years. But it was at that time he sat down and he wrote it all down. It was a eureka moment.
Ralph really was pioneering in the way of understanding how broadly you could use the TV for something other than passive viewing.
With this box, when a commercial comes on, push the button, a tape recorder starts, the TV set is recorded.
His vision was that everyone already had this TV, they could do more with it.
Next morning, you can't remember the station on which you saw this thing you really wanted to go out and buy.
One of the really novel things that it could do was impulse buying.
I go ahead and push the appropriate number, dial my 800 number on the telephone, and lo and behold, my order is placed in a rather painless way.
It was Amazon, circa 1969. The company he was working for at the time, Sanders & Associates, was a defense contractor.
He got Sanders to let him build a lab. He just said, I have this idea, and let me play with it.
Back in those days, you could just pull people off the line. So he pulled a couple of guys. He said he had a secret room up on the 6th floor. And he's starting to tinker with television games.
So he had his own area with a couple of people who worked for him and essentially did everything on his own to develop the brown box.
The original brown box prototype did many, many things. Ping pong ultimately was the one that really caught on.
My father brought home one of the prototypes, and my brother and I played it. We were the first kids to play video games. We had the first video game parties, and I won.
I think the record's clear that he lost all of the time.
I defeated my brother, regardless of what he says.
But Sanders Management decided we are not a consumer electronics company. We're not going to build this.
Sanders was looking for a licensee because they were not in the business of doing consumer products.
And he finally sits down with Magnavox, and they produced a commercial product called the Magnavox Odyssey. The first line Odyssey was a black and white console, and it had 2 separate apparatus where you controlled the spots. You couldn't project things on your screen without having a supercomputer. So what they did is they made plastic sheaths, and it would look like a tennis court. Odyssey was shown in 1972 in Silicon Valley. It was a demo. There were a lot of people who came, including people in other businesses.
Nolan Bushnell definitely saw the Magnavox Odyssey there. He signed the guest ledger, and he was there.
I had heard there was a video game being displayed, and I thought, that's my area. Who has the affront to do a video game? But I was unimpressed from the minute I saw it. It was fuzzy. The gameplay was funny because you had control of the ball after you hit it. Had no score, had no sound. To me, it was an incomplete project. So I improved upon it. I made it functional, and I made it better. The thought that it was going to cause me some problems didn't even enter my mind. I had visited a demo of the Odyssey. I was unimpressed, and I said, let's make this game and fix it. It was meant as an exercise, and so I assigned it to Al. I went to the blackboard and drew out what we wanted. He says, okay, I can do that.
We got it to work, but it was terrible. It was clearly no fun because it was either too fast and you couldn't get the hang of it, or it was too slow and it was boring.
Al Alcorn looked at what the Odyssey game was and found ways to make it a more compelling experience.
The first thing we had to do is make sure that the game had an offense. And that was created by the angle that the ball left the paddle be dependent on where on the paddle it hit. That's when we decided that we would increase the ball speed after X number of volleys.
And he says, oh, it's got to have sound. I said, okay, I'll be right back. And I poked around and found some sounds that were already in the sync generator and put them out. Since then, there have been articles written about how brilliant the sound was, which I think is hilarious.
In probably 3 weeks, it became so fun. We were staying after work to play the damn thing.
At some point, Nolan and Ted said, that's pretty good. Let's put it in a box and put it on location at Handicap Stavern and just see what the public thinks of it.
It was a peanut shell on the floor beer bar, you know, and it had a bunch of games in the back. 3 days later, we got a service call, and so we thought, oh, geez, we got a reliability problem.
So I went over there. To my surprise, when I opened the coin box, all these quarters gushed out. It wasn't broken. It was just so full of quarters it wouldn't take anymore.
People were waiting for the bar to open so they could come in and play Pong. They were playing it all day.
I remember sitting at Handicap Stavern, and Nolan basically says, we're going to be in the manufacturing business. And Ted and I said, no way. We're engineers. We don't know anything about manufacturing.
I said, you know, I think we can sell these things. We had enough money, $300, to buy the parts for 12 units. And literally in 3 weeks, we built the 12 and sold them all for $1,000. I went to Al and I said, you know, we've got to ramp up 200 a day. He says, you've lost your mind, Nolan.
Insane. Whenever I see a new idea, I immediately think of all the reasons it can't work. I'm a pessimist.
But I'm an optimist, and I really do believe if you think you can do it, it will get that way.
We had no experience, we had no employees, we had no money, we had no space.
We rented an old defunct skating rink. That was our manufacturing facility.
But how do you hire people? The only thing that occurred to us is just go to the unemployment office and get people, and what could go wrong?
I didn't realize that all these people were derelicts, and of course we didn't have security.
It was crazy time.
But piece by piece by piece, we actually started to know what we were doing.
Here is where it all takes place. The Atari Engineering Building. With bucolic surroundings and picturesque Sunnyvale, staffed by a group of technical people who are truly outstanding in their field.
I walked into Atari and I saw a bunch of people having just a blast working. They were excited about what they were doing. They were my age. It was just exciting as heck.
It wasn't like work. We had rock and roll music blasting through the factory, which was totally awesome. I remember Steve Miller, the Moody Blues.
We felt we could hire anyone, no matter how strange they were.
Fully factory conditioned with genuine Atari parts stolen direct from the Atari factory.
I wrote a manifesto that encapsulated the values of our company. We wanted to treat everyone as equally as we possibly could. For example, I wouldn't allow reserved parking spaces for the executives. We don't care how you dress. We don't care when you come to work. We don't care if you come to work. Get your job done and everything's fine. We had this attitude of people were adults and free to do as they wished.
We were young, horny engineers, and we'd ogle, and there was funny banter.
I remember one girl made bikini tops out of leather that some people wore. But you didn't wear bikini bottoms. That was uncalled for.
Did a lot of people go home together? Absolutely.
But it was the 70s, and that was part of American culture in the 70s. I think it's difficult to look at that through today's lens because it was a very different era.
What do we want?
The 70s were really the birth of feminism, and Atari led the way in all that. Atari had an equal pay for equal work policy.
I never thought the women or men were treated any different. And I had like 48 people working for me one time, and nobody treated me any different because I was a woman.
There was also this whole idea of hot tub culture. Something that, through the lens of today, probably looks a little bit promiscuous. People would get naked and get in a hot tub at the end of a party. I mean, it was kind of normal.
I think it was a woman who installed it.
I was in charge of picking out colors for all the different parts, and that included the tiles for the hot tub, which were a blue and orange. They had the Atari logo on the back wall.
I remember the day Nolan and I decided we're going to break the hot tub in.
There were times where it was locked and people were in it, so you can use your imagination of what might have been going on in the hot tub room.
I was never in that hot tub. Other hot tubs, but not that one.
We actually had a board meeting one time in the hot tub. We didn't even think about it.
One more. Now he's really in cornflakes. 2, 3, 4. Yes.
Atari, to me, kind of set the standards for how to have a fun company.
every 2 weeks, if we met quota, there was a beer bus with free pizza and beer.
By this time, we were pretty well known as the most fun place to work in Silicon Valley.
We were hearing stories about Atari. I mean, it had kind of a legendary culture. They're all doing dope on the assembly line. Nolan was probably high a good chunk of the time, too.
There was a funny smell to the air.
This is how we put out games, huh? Engineering in action.
There was a lot of pot.
So I don't know if you know the name of rolling papers. It was SD Modiano. So anybody in the company could use the pager to page the whole building, and you would hear, SD Modiano to the upstairs conference room, please. And that was the key that anybody wanted to go up and smoke a joint.
I remember the day they said, don't smoke pot in front of the building. Just go out back. And so we did. It was a great place to work. I would do it all over again. Absolutely. Without the drugs.
What does your family do on those stay indoors rainy afternoons? Or on those cold, blustery winter days? Entertain themselves with Odyssey.
Odyssey finally came to market in 1972. It took a while. Magnavox did drag their feet.
By the time it did come out, the technology underneath the hood was no longer as current as it could have been.
They sold about 350,000 of these units. Pretty good sales, but it certainly didn't blow up.
The Magnavox Odyssey was not a failure, but it was not a great success. Part of that was Magnavox.
Want to save $50 and solve 2 gift problems at once? Get Odyssey by Magnavox.
Ralph would have liked to have seen it marketed better.
This $99.95 value is only $49.95 when you buy any Magnavox TV 17 inches or larger.
Magnavox made televisions, and many people assumed they would need a Magnavox television to operate this device.
They limited the potential. My father was very annoyed.
Odyssey, now at your Magnavox dealer.
I think Ralph thought they had compromised too much.
So it didn't get out into the consciousness of the nation the way that something novel might get out today. I think Ralph felt a little bit neglected and left in the dust.
And he felt that Magnavox should have been doing more, and he pushed them to call their lawyers.
Pong was a phenomenon, so sales were easy. The distributors would say, send me 10, send me 10. And all of a sudden, I had a backlog of 4,000 units. The problem was that anybody could climb into the business.
Everybody was copying our machine. But in those days, we didn't think much of patents.
Because in the video game business, technology is moving so quickly. We always had better things to do with our time than patent litigation.
Atari's commitment to innovation was so great that they really weren't concerned about controlling the industry.
We had a strategy of just doing better and better and better. And so from Pong, we went to Pong doubles and Quadra Pong, and then Space Race. We just kept them coming.
There was Tank, which ended up being a really big game for us.
Gotcha, Night Driver, Sprint, a great driving game, a lot of fun, had nothing to do with reality.
I had a game that I wanted built called Breakout, which is a ball and paddle game, and none of my engineers wanted to do it. But one day, a guy came into the lobby and said, I'm not leaving until you hire me. He was scruffy, ill-kempt, and brash. It was Steve Jobs. I asked Steve to do Breakout on the night shift because I knew if Steve was on the night shift, Steve Wozniak would come over after work at Hewlett-Packard, and I knew the two of them could get this game knocked out in really good time. And they did.
We both stayed up all night long, 4 nights in a row. We both got mononucleosis from it. We were really stressing ourselves, but we actually did design it.
They ended up getting a $5,000 bonus. 20 years later, Wozniak was sitting in my kitchen, and I said, hey, you know, when you got that bonus, what did you do with it? The $2,500? He shook his head and he says, Steve did it to me again. Steve had told Wozniak that it was a $500 bonus, and so he gave him $250 and kept the rest for himself. Steve did break out, and then got this idea to do a personal computer. And he came to me and said, do you want a third of Apple computer for $50,000? And I turned it down, which I've subsequently regretted. Just a little.
Nolan Bushnell, you are an acknowledged visionary in this part of the world. Did even you foresee what Pong
Well,
would bring?
I'm not sure that I thought it was going to be quite this big this quickly.
We had talked about a home version of our stuff a lot, but the economics of our technology couldn't allow it.
The only way to make a home version of Pong was to put everything on a single piece of silicon, a custom chip.
But Al came to me and said, I've just found some new technology. And so all of a sudden, the opportunity of putting Pong on a chip was real. It was a small little console, 2 knobs, and it was cute. I think we ended up building about 180,000. Sold every one of them.
At this point, Ralph Baer is still the company man at Sanders Associates, coming up with new inventions, but the phenomenal success of Home Pong would not escape his attentions.
A lot of people made a lot of money off of Dad's invention.
You want to score, Bill?
Did it annoy him that other people took credit for his work? I mean, as it would anybody.
Get closer to the net, make it a little faster. Well,
it was very important to him that people understood, you know, it was his idea originally.
It's clear that Ralph Baer was the designer of the first working game.
I never had a problem with Ralph until he started claiming that he invented Pong. He invented Odyssey, and it was very different than Pong.
Nolan Bushnell was claiming that he invented video gaming, and my father did resent someone trying to steal the credit.
If Ralph had truly been a great promoter, a self-aggrandizing kind of guy, yeah, he would have gotten a lot more recognition, probably got a lot more money, and had a lot more people behind him. But that just wasn't him.
Ralph Baer is the father of video games.
The father of video games is a construct that I kind of think is specious. I don't feel any animosity to Ralph whatsoever. I think he was a brilliant analog engineer that did some very, very good work. But in terms of commercial success, it's me, period. I think I had, at the right time, the right place, technical skills and the business smarts to launch an industry.
Ralph got that you could play a game on a TV. No one figured out how to make it fun.
It wouldn't surprise me one bit if Ralph agitated Magnavox executives that they needed to go after Atari.
It might have been the 1970s, but business is business, and there's money to be made. They went after the infringers.
Nolan Bushnell and the people at Atari were more focused on coming up with new and exciting ideas to stay ahead of the audience than they were trying to protect the ideas of games. But Ralph Baer felt very differently about patents. Ralph Baer was an engineer, and engineers live on patents.
Ralph Baer and Magnavox sent us a letter noticing that they had a patent on the whole thing and wanted us to stop making them, you know.
I thought it was specious because their technology was different as cheese and chalk.
When I read that letter, I said, this patent's because the patent was very broad.
And the reason it could be broad was because it was the first one that was out there, was definitive.
They were asserting that a spot colliding with another spot on a video screen was protected by their patents.
Ralph was extremely good at keeping notes.
He wrote everything down, which actually was great in the end because there's no way that he would have been able to have the success that he did had he not done so.
he could come up with an idea and write it down in the form of disclosures so that the lawyers could translate directly into the forms. He got very good at that.
That helped enormously for patent enforcement.
Our attorneys saying we could fight them, we could win. And Nolan said, fine, how much will that cost? Oh, at least $1 million.
I didn't want to spend a lot of time litigating it. And so I agreed to a paid-up license.
Ironically, this settlement was one of the keys to Atari's success.
Here's the trick. I decided that we would settle, but only for a de minimis amount of money. And in our settlement, I required them to go after our competitors.
So Magnavox sued all of the players of the day.
It was going to weaken our competitors, and it was strengthening me. No harm, no foul. So I wasn't that concerned about the Sanders Magnavox lawsuit, because I knew I had other things up my sleeve.
Here we go. Up.
In the beginning of the home console, the machine played one game.
Missed it. One up.
The next step would be, what about a machine that can play multiple games?
We had a research group up in Grass Valley, and we had given them the task of designing this system.
Everything that was up there was a little bit hush-hush.
They were like our secret group, we call them.
They worked together like a fine Swiss watch. I mean, it was a dream team.
I was hired because I could write a game and design chips. And without knowing what my mission was to help prove that a programmable design would work.
The Grass Valley group had developed this prototype for this home cartridge-based video game that was called the Atari VCS, or the 2600.
It was a great prototype. The problem was we just didn't have enough capital to bring it into the market the correct way.
And so they looked for a buyer in the entertainment space.
It is my privilege to invite you inside Atari. During the next few minutes, I will show you why this is such an exciting company and tell you about some of our plans for the future.
Bankers and everybody started coming through, and so the company tried to clean us up and make it a little bit more corporate, giving us a little bit better dress code and no bare midriffs.
We talked to Intel and National Semiconductor, the Silicon Valley neighbors, really. Nobody saw it. And then we got introduced to Warner.
I got a call one day, would you be interested in a fast-growing, technology-based entertainment company? And those words sounded good, so I said yes. And that was my introduction to Atari. They showed me early prototypes of the 2600, which was the programmable video game. It was an aha moment for me. I said, I have seen the future, and it's called the 2600. I said, this is a deal.
We had a flash meeting at Nolan's house in the hot tub, and he said Warner's offered $28 million to buy the company. Holy moly, this was just mind-blowing.
I thought, all of a sudden, I've got a bigger sandbox I can play in.
It was wonderful in the beginning. But it was a very strange marriage because this is a very conservative East Coast classic public company, and we were not.
The snake eats the gun.
Yeah. Just touching it?
No, it eats it.
It eats it.
Comes down and gobbles it up. And then the snake gets one segment longer.
How can a snake eat that? Bug shooter.
I remember writing a memo that said, the problem here is these guys are all a little out of control, and if we give them too much money, I don't know how I'm going to control them.
Why?
Why?
I don't believe there was understanding on the part of Warner management of how fast tech moves, and that a breakthrough piece of technology today is trash in 3 years. And I felt that we needed to start work immediately on the replacement for the VCS.
I think it was 1978. We used to have budget meetings in New York in December. You'd have all the Warner people in the room and all the company people in the room. This is for every division. And at some point, Nolan said,
We got to start immediately on the next generation of the VCS.
get rid of all the inventory, it's over.
And they said, we just bought this. Why would you do that? Well, it wasn't new technology. I mean, the VCS only had 128 bytes of RAM. That's nothing. I wanted to sell as many VCSs as quickly as possible, then move on to new technology.
I mean, the Atari people are looking at me like I'm supposed to know what this is all about, and everybody had the same reaction. What the are you talking about? What is he talking about? I got called into Steve Ross's office, who was the CEO of the company, the next morning, and Steve was kind of panicky. He said, the guy he bought the company from has just told him it's all over but the shouting. But I said, Steve, you don't know what you're talking about. In my opinion, on December 26th, there will not be a 2600 on any shelf in any store in America. And if that is true, this business is about to take off. And by the way, if it's not true, and of course, it was a feeding frenzy. It was the hottest product in America.
Attention, shoppers. The new Atari cartridge game is in.
You can get 9 cartridges, 187 games.
I'd like an Atari.
Sorry, only our demonstrators left. Mine! No, George. Mine.
Atari took off like a rocket. It was the fastest growing company in the history of the United States at that point.
In that 6-month period, after we bought Atari, the consumer division started to take off.
3 years ago, the video game industry was practically unknown. Now it's producing one of the hottest consumer items of the Christmas season.
The 2600 was one of the great businesses. It was an amazing business.
Man, he was able to nurse 2 years more than I would have ever guessed. But that doesn't say that I wasn't right.
Of course I was right.
Manny was right. He called it right.
I wasn't wrong about it. Maybe by 2 years.
There were definitely clashes between Nolan and Manny.
It was a freewheeling, wild place, and the company was growing. But I don't think you can run a company making money hand over fist in the Wild West. I think, honestly, it was just hard for Nolan to let go.
Piece by piece by piece, there was a disillusionment setting in. This wasn't my company anymore, and I wasn't the chief architect and P.T. Barnum and Disney of this.
I have vivid memories of screaming board meetings. Nolan had vehement disagreement with the direction of things.
Well, it's not that he was a pain in the ass, which he was at times, but Nolan has 100 ideas a minute, and he believes they're all wonderful, and they're not. There are sometimes some really good ones, but he loves them all because they're all his children. He was not meant to manage an enterprise as big as this one became. Period. End of comment.
Ask grown.
My mission was to find adult supervision.
Warner had a relationship with a guy named Ray Kassar. They said this guy might be the perfect guy for head of consumer division.
And we hired him because Ray had the kind of background in terms of just general business that made sense to me.
Those of us in the lab could see that it was not going in good directions. Nolan was moved out of day-to-day operations, promoted, quote unquote, to chairman of the board.
I don't know how Ray Kassar was picked to be put in charge of it. He didn't understand the video game industry at all.
Ray came from being the CEO of a fabric company.
Ray just didn't seem to get it at all.
Let me explain Atari engineers to you. One day I was in the engineering building, in the men's room, standing at a urinal, and I saw a pair of bare feet next to me. And there was a guy standing there in a bathing suit. I walked out, I said, who was that? Oh, that's so-and-so. He doesn't like clothes. Okay, but that's how you manage engineers. Nolan got that. I mean, even I got that. But that never made Ray comfortable. I've reflected a lot on the mistakes we made at Atari, because we made some big ones. But the biggest one I think Ray made was there was a complete disconnect. They didn't like him. He wasn't one of them.
I believe the saying is Ray could start with an ass.
Ray wanted to have an executive dining room, reserve parking spots for the executives, which was just against the DNA of the company.
Good afternoon, Atari Sales.
I mean, it all just felt bad to me.
My group in marketing services is responsible to achieve maximum visibility for video games.
We must take into consideration the ease of comprehending the objective of the game.
It was unpleasant. They were trying to make Atari more like New York, like a corporate Wall Street company.
What we've just shown you are some of the programs that prepare us at Atari for our future growth. To maintain that growth, we will continue to expand our advertising programs.
There was increasingly an us versus them mentality. Ray thought that I was an out-of-control lunatic, and I thought he was a pompous ass. He was single-handedly dismantling the corporate culture. The company, as it had become, was not fun anymore.
Nolan said, we want to be out. And we did. Because at that point, we were beyond the pale, and we were glad to.
I said I quit, and they said, no, you're fired.
You kind of felt like Dad got kicked out of the house. That's kind of how it felt, and you don't really know why, because no one really knew why.
It was sad to see him go, because as far as we were concerned, he was the father of it as well.
It was like part of our family was ripped away.
But pretty soon, the rug was going to be pulled out from under all of them.
This symphony of electronic noises is the music of money. Nearly $3 billion were stuffed into video games last year.
This year, as if to prove they are not a passing fad, 5.5 million video game consoles will be sold.
The early 80s was the golden age of the video game business.
The home video game market was exploding, but it was really the arcade game market that was driving it. That's where the big hit games came from. Atari had a slew of them, and other companies as well.
All these really great games that were so different from one another. Asteroids.
Centipede.
Tempest. Galaga.
Missile Command. Battlezone has to be in that group.
Defender. Joust.
Dig Dug, and obviously Donkey Kong.
One of the earliest games that cemented video games as a lasting medium was Space Invaders.
Space Invaders was a successful arcade game that Atari didn't write.
Space Invaders was a phenomenon in the arcades. And I moseyed over one day to the engineering building, and all the engineers are playing a coin-op version of Space Invaders. And I immediately walked back across the street to Ray Kassar's office. I said, Ray, here's what I want. Take that Space Invaders and build a consumer version of that game and license the name from it. Pay them. If you can't license the name, steal the gameplay. I don't care, but I want that game. When we introduced the cartridge, that blew the 2600 into the next universe.
The hypnotic appeal of electronically destroying enemy invaders led to one of the biggest and fastest toy industry booms in history.
Space Invaders was successful because the VCS was capable of displaying that game as it was presented in the arcade world.
Arcade technology was more robust than what you could put in your living room. Pac-Man was a big hit in the arcade, but you played it on the 2600, and it just didn't seem like quite the same game. It just didn't have what the game gave you in an arcade.
Pac-Man has to have all these ghosts running around, and you're a player, and you can go anywhere, and these little tiny dots that the graphics system wasn't capable of drawing.
And it got a reputation for what people called Flickerman.
The Atari 2600 had a huge amount of compromises in it. It was a very primitive system for the time.
The Atari 2600 was still alive 10 years after its launch, so that technology was pretty old, and the rest of the world was catching up, coming up with better and faster hardware. Atari was still riding the old dinosaur when they could have been innovating new hardware. Virtually every game we made on the 2600, we had to come up with some programming technique that made it do something it was never intended to do.
We expected this thing to sell well for 2 or 3 years. It sold well for a dozen, because the programmers turned out to be a lot smarter than we expected them to be.
I'm David Crane, C-R-N-E.
Larry Kaplan, K-A-P-L-A-N.
Al Miller.
Y-O-L-E-R.
Yes. Bob Whitehead.
I was part of a group of 4 guys that said, wait a minute, of the top 20 selling games, 2/3 of them were designed by the 4 of us. Well, we sat across from Ray Kassar and said, games that we made you $60 million last year, and we're getting $24,000 salaries. Doesn't seem to be equitable. We just like to have a piece, just something, a royalty, a bonus. And Ray looked at us across his desk and said, these are Atari products. The guy down on the assembly line is as important to the game as you are, because if he didn't put them together, you wouldn't be able to sell any.
At Atari, we don't really like to talk about who designed what.
Why not?
Well, because we like to make the game the superstar as opposed to the programmer.
Why shouldn't you get credit if you design the game?
Well, because it is a corporate product. Okay, these are games by Atari, so it keeps more of a corporate image. You're buying Atari products.
At that point, we knew it was over at Atari.
Were the 4 of you at Atari when you decided to strike out?
Yes, we worked together in designing games and decided that we wanted to go off and try something on our own.
We decided we're going to go out and produce, manufacture, and publish our own games, and that is how we ended up founding Activision. But Atari had a monopoly. The only cartridges that would work on the Atari console were Atari cartridges.
Atari kept their first machine as a black box. They didn't tell anybody how it worked, and they didn't really welcome third-party developers to make something that would work on the platform.
So before we could make a game, we had to reverse engineer the 2600, and that's something that I did in the spare bedroom of my apartment. For years, I had been trying to put a little running man into a video game. But the Atari 2600 was not designed to do that. I said, I am going to do this, if it kills me.
I was lost in the jungle with Pitfall Harry, surrounded by giant scorpions and man-eating crocodiles.
If you haven't met Pitfall Harry, you're missing the year's most incredible video game adventure. Pitfall for the Atari 2600 and Intellivision, designed by David Crane for Activision.
I believe that Activision sold about 4.5 million copies of Pitfall, generating around $50 million in wholesale revenues.
Just last night.
Not everyone knows that it was one of Jack Black's first commercial appearances. He was only 12 at the time, I think.
I knew that the long arm of Atari was going to come and try to put them out of business legally. Just because that's who they were.
We had good lawyers, and we were told, they're going to sue you. They don't have any grounds to sue you, but yes, Atari sued us.
They were sued for theft of trade secrets.
They just assumed that we had stolen intellectual property, and we hadn't done anything like that.
I don't remember the issues, but yes, we didn't win.
Once the lawsuit was settled with Atari, it was clear that making video games for someone else's console was something that could be done. Thus, what we did was create the third-party video game software publishing business we know today.
Anybody could make a cartridge for the 2600, and it was what killed the company.
For the Atari Video Computer System, Star Master by Activision.
After that Activision lawsuit, dozens of companies got into the business.
Overnight, there were 30 companies making video games for the Atari 2600 system. They were all just young startups picking programmers off the street.
People who could knock these things out could make a huge profit selling junk.
Games like Lost Luggage, even Quaker Oats started making Atari 2600 games.
There was the fabled Custer's Revenge, which was essentially raping Indian women. That's basically what it was. Now, we're making a game for kids with the 2600, and we have no control. Forget the quality. The content of the stuff was out of control.
Now, Atari had its stinkers like E.T.
E.T., the Atari 2600 game, is widely considered to be the worst game ever made.
Steven Spielberg, who directed the movie, insisted the game be programmed to follow the movie plot.
Steve Ross was the chairman and CEO of Warner Communications. And he was wooing Steven Spielberg. He liked him, they liked each other. I don't remember the numbers, but it was a guarantee that was north of $20 million for this cartridge. We were crazed.
But it had to be out by Christmas, and by the time that deal was signed, there were 6 weeks left to make the game.
The video game that lets you help E.T. get home, just in time for Christmas. Happy holidays from Atari.
It was doomed to fail from the moment you told them, you got 15 minutes to make a cartridge, so do the best you can.
The first screen, you move the joystick, he falls in a pit. Game over. I mean, I'm a game expert, and I couldn't get the guy out of the pit either.
It was terrible.
It sold like gangbusters for a week. And then they started being returned.
And there was this urban legend that millions of E.T. cartridges had been buried in the desert. It's a great story, except it wasn't true.
At the time, the factory in El Paso was closing, and they just took everything wholesale out of there. It wasn't just ETs, it was 400s, 800s, parts. They couldn't let it on the market, so they just put it in a landfill.
Regardless, E.T. was a very poor business decision and cost millions and millions and millions of dollars.
There may be trouble in Toyland, at least in the video games division.
Warner Communications, the parent company that owns Atari, has been having major problems since Christmas.
On December 7th, I remember I got a call. The CFO said, we're going to fall below the estimates by 30%. And that was the beginning of this sort of unraveling, if you will.
The problem is an overabundance of competition. Atari was once one of 3 companies in this business.
This year, we have about 25 companies selling cartridges.
The ability for third parties to make software was where Atari died. If we could ever have solved the third-party software, we'd have been fine.
A lot of people think that it was bad software, this and that. It wasn't that at all. They tried to put 15 million units into the market that was saturated. And that's what caused the collapse.
Warner Communications down 1 1/4 points today, 16 3/4 points yesterday.
Atari Incorporated is laying off 1,700 employees in California.
Atari had to lay off massive numbers of people and eventually had to sell the consumer division.
It got sold, it got split in 2.
Atari was gone.
I felt Atari was my baby. It was my heritage. It was really sad to see it die.
It was the best place you could ever hope to work. I found myself walking the halls of this empty building, and poof, everybody was gone.
I've read some things now when Nolan says the worst thing we ever did was sell it to Warner Communications. That's just stupid.
I can remember in 1983 Manny saying, well, the video game business is over. I think it's the only time in the history of business where the market leader abandoned their business. And I've often kicked myself for not going out, raising money, and taking it back over.
Nolan really predicted exactly what happened, so it was sad.
I just sort of shook my head and clucked my tongue and said, too bad.
People thought that the end of Atari meant the end of the video game industry, but it turned out that they were wrong.
suddenly, surprising as it may seem, the video game industry is in trouble.
In 1983, there was a big decline in the market triggered by the implosion of Atari.
Warner Communications, which lost $500 million last year on its Atari division, has had enough. It's selling Atari and getting out of video games and computers.
After Atari crashed, the video game industry was dead.
As Warner's goes, so goes the industry?
I think that's true.
It was dead as a doornail.
Are video game addicts losing their addiction? Is the home video game concept just a fad?
The media concluded home video games were a passing fashion.
The video game industry is now becoming very much like hula hoops.
People stopped buying, and down it went.
EA Sports' first products are coming out in 1983, and our salespeople are saying, who do we sell these to?
At the same time that there was this collapse in the United States, the home video game market in Japan was red hot with the introduction of Nintendo's Family Computer System, or Famicom.
The Famicom came out in 1983, and in Japan, it was a huge success. But in the US market, we weren't ready for it yet because the retailers were too burned. That left us kind of in a quandary. What do we do? And the answer was, we wait.
So we made sure that when we introduced our product, we could convince retailers to take it.
Eventually, in 1985, Nintendo came out with an entertainment system.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included.
They launched it as a robot.
Rob the Robot. Rob the Robot was an accessory that worked with the Nintendo Entertainment System. In reality, it was, the Trojan horse.
We all now know the robot wasn't that fantastic.
But it allowed Nintendo to go to the retailers and say, come on and talk to us. We got this new cool thing. It's not a video game system, but the entertainment system that uses technology to do all these things.
The Nintendo Entertainment System comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
We knew all along that once it was successful, Rob the Robot would hit the dust. Before we introduced the NES, Nintendo was strictly a coin-operated video game company. And one of its great hits was Donkey Kong.
Nintendo really focused on making games that were deep and interesting and compelling, and because they had this wonderkind there.
Donkey Kong was created by a very young employee, Shigeru Miyamoto, an artist by trade. Turned out that he was a creative genius. In the game, there's a little guy with a mustache and a red hat who is dodging balls that are being thrown by a gorilla. We had to come up with a name for this character, and somebody remembered the name of our landlord, Mario Segale. So we decided that we would call this character Mario, and Mr. Miyamoto loved it, and so he started creating Mario games.
Mario!
There is no substitute for great games. That's the key to this business. And without question, the game that made Nintendo, both in the United States and around the world, was Super Mario Brothers.
Many people think of Mr. Miyamoto as kind of like the Steven Spielberg of video games.
It's a little bit hallucinogenic, I think, if you think about Mario Brothers. The fact that he put that on the screen is testimony, his kind of creative comfort level, that he was willing to express himself with such random, weird stuff. And he distilled it down into a little scenario within the game that just made it so catnippy.
This year, kids and their parents will spend more than $3 billion on video games and game cartridges. Almost 9 out of 10 of those dollars on Nintendo.
Pretty quickly, we realized video games weren't dead, and kids were still loving playing them.
Sales took off.
People were clamoring for the product, and we couldn't keep it on retail shelves.
Volleyball?
Sold out. Mike Tyson sold out.
Everything's sold out.
Everything is sold out, yes.
By 1986, we knew that we had a mega hit on our hands.
But about the time that we were in full launch of the NES, there was another Japanese company that was making video games.
The game business's giant, Nintendo, is no longer the only game in town.
We certainly knew of Sega. Sega introduced a home video game system in competition with Nintendo.
The Sega Master System was an 8-bit system, and it was not very successful against Nintendo in any market.
The Sega Master System was rolling back the clock, because here's these games in the arcade that look cool, but then when you see them on the home system, they just look crappy. So nobody thought Nintendo could ever be unseated by somebody like Sega. We were riding that rocket ship of growth. Nobody thought it was going to end.
I was in Hawaii. I had most recently been CEO of Universal Matchbox, and we had sold the company to Tyco. So I was unemployed on a beach in Hawaii with my family. And all of a sudden, Hayao Nakayama, the CEO of Sega of Japan, appears in his suit and tie and starts talking to me about Sega. I wanted to know how the hell he found me. And second of all, what are you doing here? Well, he wanted me to come back to Japan with him and look at what 16-bit technology could do for the video game industry.
Every system up until then had been 8-bit technology.
The last thing I thought I was going to do was enter the video game market. But when I saw 16-bit, I actually was blown away. 16-bit was so different, so dramatically better. I joined the company.
Tom Kalinske was this superstar, hotshot executive from the toy industry, and we couldn't believe that he would join a little company like ours.
I thought there was a chance of at least grabbing some market share from Nintendo.
When Sega decided to launch 16-bit Sega Genesis, Nintendo was very formidable. And Tom Kalinske often called this David and Goliath.
What's the hottest 16-bit video game system with true arcade games, great graphics, real challenge, stereo sound, and the hottest library too? Genesis from Sega. Genesis, the new generation in video games.
By the end of 1986, Nintendo had essentially 100% of the home video game market in the United States.
But Nintendo didn't want to just make a platform that, like early Ataris, could just be crushed by bad product and shovelware.
So we had to figure out some way to keep bad games, or games that we did not control, off our system.
They wanted to control everything, and they wanted to be able to approve games in advance and improve the final version after they would personally test it. It was really a financially challenging model.
Nintendo's response was to come down with an iron fist. They controlled the market from top to bottom.
The FTC is still investigating charges Nintendo has unfairly monopolized the highly lucrative software end of the video game market.
They did care what the titles were, and they were very strict about it. They were a bully.
I don't perceive myself as a bully. I don't think that Nintendo was ever a bully. And it worked in the sense that the home video game business didn't collapse. In fact, it arose.
We haven't done anything wrong here. What we've done in the last 3.5 years is to single-handedly recreate a dead industry. We have resurrected the home video game business.
A lot of the third parties really resented how Nintendo had ordered them around, and it was clear we needed the support of important third parties. And one of the most important that I could see was Electronic Arts.
The part of the industry that I helped pioneer was video game publishing as we know it today. It was pretty much an amateur operation until I launched Electronic Arts. I began to take Sega seriously when I heard rumors that they had a 16-bit machine. We thought, wow, we could really make some great games for this. And I thought, you know, why don't we just figure out for ourselves how to make games for this machine, and then we don't have to be bound by an onerous license agreement.
I'd heard from my staff that EA had reverse engineered the Genesis system, and they were planning to release games on the Sega Genesis system without paying a royalty to us. And I thought that was wrong. So I went to EA and had a rather unfriendly meeting with Trip Hawkins.
Tom was actually very useful because he's a good, reasonable, articulate American businessman.
He may not remember this, but I asked him, I said, Trip, did your mother ever teach you the difference between right and wrong? And he got quite upset over that.
Sega said to him, you work with us together to beat Nintendo. And Trip liked that idea.
And we worked out a license agreement that turned out to be a win-win.
The EA breakthrough helped us convince other third-party developers to take the battle with Nintendo and just tell them they were going to publish on Sega Genesis. And Nintendo wasn't happy about it. They were so stuck in their ways, it made it somewhat easy for us to take them on. But we needed a character who could compete effectively with Mario.
As Nintendo often said, the name of the game is the game. One game can change the fate of the company. If I have to mention only one reason why Sega succeeded, it is Sonic the Hedgehog.
When I finally got a chance to see the actual game, I was blown away. It showed off the graphics of the Genesis system. It showed off the speed. I wasn't sure it could ever be as successful as Mario was, but by God, we were going to try to make it such. I knew that instead of going directly against Nintendo, we had to do something different. So my basic philosophy was, all right, we're going to leave them the 9 to 12-year-old boy, and we're going to go after an older age group.
16-bit marketplace, we believe, is a much more sophisticated marketplace, and we're directing this towards the teenager and the young adult.
Nintendo was the game system your parents wanted you to play. This was the one that your kind of devious uncle would let you play.
And then in terms of our marketing, we took Nintendo on. We made fun of them.
What Nintendo?
Sega does what Nintendo don't or something. I thought it was kind of funny, quite frankly.
We also moved to the famous Scream.
Sega! Sega! Sega!
Sega! I started taking my kids to school in the morning, and when our car would pull up, the girls would yell, Sega! Back at me. I thought, wow, I've even got the girls yelling Sega. This is great.
We had a goal to beat Nintendo. Every time something came up and it was a hurdle, it was like, well, what would we need to do to beat Nintendo?
They came in with an attack that Mario was a dumpy old plumber, and they had something that was faster, cooler. And you know, you can't just turn around and say, oh no, Mario's cooler.
They were an easy target. We knew they wouldn't respond. And so you could be nimble and sort of run around them.
They were in your face in terms of their commercials and marketing.
Sonic 2 fits easily into any tackle box. Act now.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
I used to get nasty letters from Howard Lincoln to cease and desist our advertising.
I don't think we took anything like that seriously until they started gaining market share. Then we did take it seriously.
work environment at Sega was really a lot of fun. We were one of those companies that had the ping pong table, and we were shooting Nerf things at each other. In that sense, we were a throwback to the Atari days.
We were a wild bunch of different types of characters.
Nintendo, on the other hand, was lean and mean. We were conservative.
Nintendo was run like an army.
Listen up. You have to take your oral examination. You have to take your oral test.
Sega was run more like a dude ranch.
I don't think there's any clearer way of showing the difference between the Nintendo attitude and the Sega attitude than Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat was a game designed to appeal to the older interests of a teenage boy.
If you knock her out 2 times, then you get to kill her.
Kids love blood and guts, and it makes something exciting.
It had pretty gratuitous violence.
Taking our hearts and ripping heads off.
Blood was flowing freely.
Heads are yanked off with their spines attached.
If you take a guy's head off, that's what the kids want out there.
You laugh today and you say, well, why does everybody get so upset about this? The problem was, it was the first game that has blood in it.
The publisher Acclaim decided to publish for both Sega Genesis and the Nintendo Super NES.
And when we told Howard Lincoln, they actually went into a deep review and said, I don't know if it's going to fit for their system.
We were very concerned with the type of content of the games. We had our own internal guidelines for what was acceptable, and we concluded that we could not allow blood on the Nintendo version.
Howard said, you have to make the blood green. So we said, sure, we'll make the blood green. That's what you want, Howard? We'll make the blood green.
Everybody knew it was silly. And I thought what Nintendo was doing was censorship.
At Sega, it was this statement that, hey, we're going to let you see the red blood. And they're not.
Super Nintendo has a more tame version of Mortal Kombat, but some believe the company's effort to sanitize the game will kill off most of its sales.
We clearly got branded as the cool machine, and that was something that Sega had never been before.
We've had 3 times as many orders for the Sega version as we have the Super Nintendo version.
It was much more successful on the Sega system and made Sega a much more successful company during that period of time than Nintendo.
They cleaned our clock.
Mortal Kombat created quite a fever in the marketplace from a sales standpoint, but also created quite a bit of publicity from parents.
Absolutely, I'm concerned.
I am concerned because it directly affects the behavior of my children.
I am very concerned, and there's one tape in particular that I understand is very violent. It's called Mortal Kombat.
Ultimately, that reached a point of discussion where Congress decided to take a look at game violence.
And I think it's time to draw the line. I know that one place parents want us to draw the line is with violence in video games.
Senator Lieberman and his committee decided to look into home video game violence.
What you're about to see are scenes from the most violent new video games. First, we have Mortal Kombat.
It is a sick, disgusting video game, in my judgment. Shame on people that produce that trash.
They thought this was warping the minds of children, and there should be government controls put over what kind of games should be brought out into the marketplace.
If you don't do something about it, we will.
Decision was made to send me, although I'd only been at Sega for a few months. But I did have the benefit of having multiple years at Nintendo.
We decided to send Bill White to represent Sega because Bill had worked for Howard, and we thought this was going to really get under Howard's skin.
I can't sit here and allow you to be told that somehow the video game business has been transformed today from children to adults. It hasn't been, and Mr. White, who is a former Nintendo employee, knows the demographics as well as I do.
Howard was actually an attorney by practice, so I don't know that it was a very fair setup for Bill. I think he got kind of thrown to the wolves.
Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do.
Nintendo basically took the side of the senators.
Howard Lincoln presented Nintendo as being the perfect company. He pretended to be literally saint-like. But then Bill White pulls out a rifle.
A rapid-fire machine gun
And said, what are you talking about? Look at this rifle you guys have.
that uses the same technology to our understanding with several games available, and they have no rating on that product to suggest that product's for adults.
Nintendo produces that, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. I must say, to me, that looks like a weapon.
We tried to dissuade the senators from this viewpoint that everybody who played video games was a child. And that just wasn't the case.
The average Sega Genesis user is almost 19 years old, and fewer than 30% are under age 13.
They all thought it was little kids playing at home with their moms, and it wasn't.
Thank you, Mr. Lincoln. You're not perfect, but you've been a damn sight better than the competition. I find the course of behavior by Sega the most objectionable here in these games that we're talking about.
It was not a good day for Sega.
I was quite angry with Howard over his performance. So we had a few nasty comments back and forth.
I sent him a poem. Roses are red, violets are blue. You've had a bad day, Tom. Boo-hoo-hoo. But there was a growing concern that the Senate hearings would have a negative impact on sales of home video games.
Because of the negative publicity, we were very concerned about a crash occurring again.
Ultimately, though, it was in Nintendo's best interest and Sega's best interest to develop a rating system that allowed the consumer parents to choose what games were right for their children.
It helped establish that there's different types of games that are appropriate for different ages or for people of different tastes. And ratings really codified that for the whole industry. So it was a great thing.
The video game market actually grew substantially. It actually helped us broaden the market to go after the older age audience who now said, oh yeah, there's stuff here in this video game business that appeals to us as well.
It won't be long before budding young actors who used to dream of going to Hollywood will dream of going to Silicon Valley.
The future with CD-ROM technology means the kind of production qualities that you're used to seeing in films.
In the early 90s, it was very clear that CD-ROM was going to be the direction of games in the future. You could make a video game look like a television program with photorealistic, images and full motion video.
Cartridges were costing like $45, but with a CD-ROM, you could have all that data for $1.80 at the time.
We'd heard that Nintendo was going to work with Sony on developing the next video game system using Sony optical disc technology.
When we heard that Sony was partnering with Nintendo, it sounded like calamity. How could Sega compete with those two giants together? I was actually at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas when we were all expecting to hear the joint announcement from Sony and Nintendo.
I think there was the expectation that we were going to do something with Sony, but Nintendo made a business decision. I recall announcing that decision, and I knew it was a shocker.
Howard Lincoln surprised the world by saying that they were going to use Philips optical disc technology and not Sony. And they apparently had not told Sony this before the presentation, so the Sony executives were furious.
And it was a total what the moment. Sony was really left with its pants down. You gotta think that made it personal for Sony at that point. In Japanese culture, it was incredible humiliation for this iconic national brand like Sony to be left at the altar by Nintendo.
And so rather than work with someone else as a third-party content provider, they were intent on developing their own platform that they could control from the very beginning.
We may have poked a sleeping dragon. We poked a lot of dragons.
It may seem like a footnote in history for everyone except the game geeks, but it really was a turning point in the entire industry's development. That was like Waterloo for our industry. History would never be the same.
Sony did a very smart job of entering the market.
We knew for a fact that Sony was bringing out a system that could really hurt us badly.
The games are ready. Are you?
When we heard rumors from the development community about how powerful PlayStation was going to be, particularly about how rich and fast the 3D graphics were, we just assumed that it would be a super high-end system. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of Sony's consumer electronics products were very expensive systems.
We had heard that the Sony system was going to be a $500 priced system, and we didn't think that would be successful because we knew price was so important in the video game industry.
Nintendo wasn't terribly concerned. They thought, yeah, if they're at $500, that's a problem for them.
There was a lot of talk about what the price point was going to be. It started out at $499, and then we convinced them that it needed to be substantially lower, and they were all set to do it at $399.
I think Nintendo probably thought to themselves, well, shoot, if they want to be really aggressive, they'll offer it at $399, but that's still too high.
We agitated for a long period of time that it needed to be a lower price point, right up until the day of the announcement.
I was there in the room when the PlayStation was introduced.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation.
I had a speech prepared, but I threw it away and just said,
$299.
He said $299, and there was a gasp.
And that was the shortest speech in the history of Western business, I think.
Oh, oh.
We wanted them to say, we wanted them to know they're in trouble, that we're here to play.
We never saw a price point like that coming. There was panic in the office.
No.
We knew we were in for a battle.
They changed the whole nature of the business. Sony ends up being a real disruptor.
Sony eliminated Sega from being a hardware competitor, and it marginalized Nintendo.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. I got a little surprise for you here. 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy? Feel a little like your days are numbered?
Nintendo kind of bumped along the bottom for a number of years.
Nintendo was eventually able to come back and fight. But for Sega, it was the end.
Sega fought very fiercely. Of course, we can't give up. But eventually, our loss was very obvious.
It was the death knell of Sega.
The decision started to revert back to Japan, and I was being ordered to do things that I didn't agree with. And I was tired of not being able to make my own decisions for Sega America. And about that time, I resigned from Sega.
When I heard that Tom had retired, I sent him a letter.
Dear Tom, I was saddened to learn that you are leaving Sega.
You've done a great job over the last 6 years,
dramatically increasing Sega's market share at our expense. Let me wish you the very best of luck in your new venture.
All my best. Sincerely, Howard Lincoln, Chairman, Nintendo of America.
I was really touched by this letter.
I felt that it was the appropriate message to send to a worthy competitor. I never considered it personal. It was just a great fight between two companies. Hats off to Tom Kalinske. He did a great job. It was a great fight. At the end of the day, we had better games and deeper pockets.
It's incredible to think that Ralph Baer toiled away in his basement, and his intent was not to be in record books. He just wanted to build something cool. He just wanted to have fun, and it turned out to be something. Ralph was not recognized for a long time, but his idea has blossomed into a $100 billion industry. Why would you not be happy about that?
There is a horizontal knob here, as you can see.
When you're doing something purely out of passion, purely driven by your desire and your sincere belief in a dream, and you don't really know yet what's going to happen, and then it works, there's just no better feeling.
Now there are millions of people working in the video game business, and I'm proud of the fact that we created an industry.
Everybody was creating something brand new. It was the future, and so you just felt it in the air. It was, you know, Camelot.
We had real entrepreneurs, real entrepreneurial people looking for the next great thing and really pushing the envelope in game development. Nolan's day was really the Wild West.
Nolan likes to say that he doesn't spend his life looking in the rearview mirror.
Thinking about how sad I am over Atari being screwed up by idiots is not nearly as important as new innovative product. Ideas are actually the cheap part. Any idiot who's ever had a shower has had a good idea. It's the people that get out and work on it that matter. I believe the best life is when you work hard, play hard. Whatever you do, do it with the volume turned up.